The date was June 24th, 2025. Inside Florida State Prison, Thomas Lee Gudinas drew his final breath at 6:13 p.m. After 3 decades behind bars, the 51-year-old man's journey from a troubled youth to death row had finally reached its end. But this story begins much earlier. It begins on a night in 1994 when choices made in darkness would echo for over 30 years. Tonight, we're diving deep into the case that shocked Orlando and the execution that closed one of Florida's longest-running death penalty cases. We'll explore the crime that changed everything, the evidence that sealed his fate, and those final moments when justice was served. This is the complete story of Thomas Lee Gudinas. May 23, 1994. Orlando's nightlife was pulsing with energy, and downtown was packed with young people looking for a good time. Among them was Thomas Gudinas, just 20 years old, living the typical college lifestyle with 3 roommates in a shared apartment. The evening started like so many others. Beer, marijuana, the usual routine before heading out to paint the town red. Their destination that night was Barbarella's, one of Orlando's hottest nightclubs. Known for its thumping music and crowds that partied until dawn, it was exactly the kind of place where young people could lose themselves in the chaos. Thomas and his roommates arrived ready to drink, dance, and forget about everything else. Inside the club, the night unfolded predictably. Drinks flowed. The music pounded. Every now and then, the group would step outside to maintain their high, slipping back into the shadows before returning to the dance floor. But somewhere between the flashing lights and the alcohol, something shifted. By 3 a.m., when the club's lights came on and the crowd began to disperse, Thomas was gone. His roommates looked around, called his name, but he had vanished without a trace. Where had he gone? That question would haunt everyone who knew him. That same night, Michelle Smith had arrived at Barbarella's around 11 p.m. with her fiancé. They danced, they laughed, they lived in the moment like any young couple in love. But around 2 a.m., exhaustion set in. Michelle decided to call it a night and head to the car, while her fiancé stayed behind to say his goodbyes. Walking through the parking lots alone, Michelle made a wrong turn. That's when she first noticed him. A man hunched down behind a parked car, watching her every move. Something about his posture, his stillness, sent chills down her spine. She quickened her pace, turned around, and headed toward the correct parking lot where their car waited. But he followed. Michelle reached her vehicle, fumbled with the keys, and slipped inside, immediately hitting the lock button. Her heart was racing now. When she glanced into the rearview mirror, there he was again. Closer this time, more aggressive. The man yanked hard on the passenger door handle, trying to force his way inside. The lock held. He moved around the car like a predator circling its prey, crouched low, then tried the driver's side door. Also locked. That's when his composure shattered. "I want to," he screamed into the night air. He covered his hand with his shirt and began smashing it against her window. Again and again, the glass trembled but didn't break. Michelle's panic took over. She slammed her palm on the horn, and the sound cut through the quiet parking lot like an alarm. The noise startled him. He froze for a moment, looked around, then ran into the darkness. Michelle thought she was safe. She thought it was over. She was wrong. He hadn't gone far. He was still out there, still hunting, still waiting for the next opportunity. Just 1 hour later, that opportunity came. Michelle McGrath, 22 years old, had also spent the evening at Barbarella's with her fiancé. A recent college graduate with her entire future ahead of her, she was full of life and optimism. Like the other Michelle, she decided to leave first and get the car, while her fiancé finished up inside the club. But Michelle McGrath never made it to the parking lot. Somewhere between the club's exit and her red Geo Metro, she disappeared. Her fiancé waited, then searched, then panicked. She was simply gone. No screams, no struggle, no witnesses, just silence where there should have been laughter. The next morning brought answers that no one wanted to hear. Officer Cesari was conducting his routine bike patrol through downtown Orlando when a man named Colbert Presley flagged him down. Colbert had spotted something unusual near a parked red Geo Metro. Clothes were scattered on the ground, car keys glinting in the morning sun. But before the officer could process what he was seeing, a scream pierced the air. At 7 a.m., Jane Brand arrived at her job at Pace School. The morning was quiet, peaceful even, until she noticed someone sitting on the steps behind the building. A young man with short brown hair, wearing baggy dark shorts, his back turned to her. He looked ordinary enough, maybe 18 years old, nothing threatening about his appearance. But when Jane told him he couldn't be there, something felt wrong. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he stood up slowly, fumbling with the front of his shorts, as if adjusting something or hiding something. Then, without a single word, he walked up the steps, climbed over the brick wall, and disappeared into the alley beyond. His behavior was strange enough that Jane decided to follow him. She wanted to understand what he had been doing there, why he seemed so out of place. As she rounded the corner into the alley, she found her answer. Michelle McGrath lay crumpled in the dirt, naked except for her bra, which had been pushed up her chest. Lifeless, broken. Jane's scream echoed off the alley walls. Meanwhile, Thomas was already making his move. He ran back to Michelle's abandoned car, where her clothes and keys still lay scattered on the ground. He gathered them up, climbed behind the wheel of the red Geo Metro, and sped away, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the crime scene. But the walls were already closing in. News of the murder spread quickly through Orlando, and Michelle Smith knew she had to act. The attack she had survived just hours before Michelle McGrath's death couldn't be a coincidence. She went straight to the police and described her attacker in vivid detail. When investigators showed her a photo lineup, Michelle didn't hesitate. She pointed directly at Thomas Gudinas. At trial, when asked to identify her attacker in person, she pointed at him again. There was no doubt in her mind. Jane Brand, the school employee who discovered the body, was shown the same lineup. Initially, she hesitated, unsure of her memory from that traumatic morning. But then she saw news footage of Thomas walking, and everything clicked into place. The posture, the gait, the general build. It was definitely the man she had seen on the school grounds. The identification was enough for an arrest warrant. Back at the apartment, Thomas's roommates had already started putting pieces together. He hadn't come home with them after the club closed, but by the next morning he was back, and he was covered in blood. His hands were torn up, knuckles scraped raw from what looked like a violent struggle. His underwear was soaked with something dark and sticky. When they asked what happened, Thomas had a ready explanation. He claimed he had gotten into a fight with 2 African-American men. But it was what he said next that chilled them to the bone. One roommate, trying to make sense of the situation, asked half-jokingly if Michelle had been good. Thomas didn't flinch. His response was calm, matter-of-fact, and absolutely terrifying. "Yeah," he said with a slight smile, "and I raped her while she was dead." Another roommate heard him repeat the confession later, just as calm, just as cold. "I killed her, then I raped her." The casual way he admitted to murder and necrophilia left his roommates stunned. This wasn't someone confessing out of guilt or remorse. This was someone bragging about what he had done. When the case reached court, the forensic evidence painted a picture more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Heegert, the medical examiner, testified that Michelle McGrath had died from massive head trauma. Her skull had been crushed, likely from someone stomping on her head with a heavy boot. The force had caused her brain to swell, and the resulting hemorrhage killed her sometime between 3 and 5 a.m. The evidence showed she had fought back. Bruises and cuts on her hands proved she had tried to defend herself. But it hadn't been enough. What happened after her death was savage and deliberate. She was sexually assaulted with broken pieces of a stick, one fragment driven 2 inches deep, another pushed even further. The forensic team found evidence of additional trauma, suggesting multiple objects had been used or multiple attacks had occurred. Thomas's DNA was found on the victim's body. His fingerprints were discovered on the gate near the alley where she was found and inside her stolen car. Combined with the eyewitness testimony and his own confessions, the evidence was overwhelming. During the trial, Thomas's defense team tried to explain how someone could commit such horrific acts. His mother, Karen, testified about a pregnancy that nearly destroyed her and a birth that almost killed her son. Thomas's first 6 months were a nightmare of fevers, breathing problems, and constant medical emergencies. Then came the behavioral issues. By the time he could walk, Thomas was having tantrums that lasted for hours. He would scream, shake, and fly into wild-eyed rages that seemed to come from nowhere. At school, teachers flagged him as hyperactive and impossible to control. One teacher recalled him flipping chairs in the middle of class, describing it as if a fuse inside him snapped whenever things didn't go his way. At age 6, his mother took him to Boston University for evaluation. Soon after, she turned to the Massachusetts Division of Youth Services, desperate for help. What followed was years of instability. Thomas was moved through 105 different placements over several years. Eventually, Karen was told he needed long-term residential care, but that never materialized. In all that chaos, Thomas only completed 4th grade in regular school. He eventually earned a GED, but his learning struggles were obvious. He was diagnosed with a low IQ of 85. The substance abuse started early. Alcohol, while he was still a child, then marijuana, then cocaine. He even experimented with LSD, all before his 18th birthday. His sister Michelle testified about their home life, painting a picture of extreme abuse. Their father once held Thomas's hand over an open flame as punishment for playing with matches. Another time, after Thomas wet the bed, their father forced him to stand outside half-naked, holding a sign that read, "I will not wet the bed." According to Michelle, things improved after their parents divorced, and Thomas even got along well with their stepfather. But by then, the damage was already done. Despite the tragic background, the jury saw through the defense's arguments. The evidence was too strong, the crime too heinous, and Thomas's own admissions too damning. They found him guilty on every count. While Thomas spent years claiming he suffered from bipolar disorder and severe mental illness, arguing he wasn't capable of rational intent when he killed Michelle McGrath, the courts disagreed. 10 out of 12 jurors voted for death. On June 16, 1995, a Florida judge sentenced Thomas to die for the first-degree murder of Michelle McGrath. He also received 30 years for attempted burglary with assault, 30 years for attempted battery, and life sentences for each count of sexual battery. Thomas spent the next 30 years appealing his sentence and living on death row. As his June 24, 2025 execution date approached, his lawyers made one final desperate attempt to save his life. Just weeks before the scheduled execution, they filed a new appeal with the Florida Supreme Court. They argued that Thomas suffered from serious mental illness, including psychosis and delusional thinking. According to his defense team, executing him would violate the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The appeal focused not only on his mental state at the time of the crime, but also on his current condition after 3 decades on death row. His lawyers argued that Thomas might not even understand why he was being punished anymore, which is a key legal requirement in death penalty cases. But the courts had heard enough. The appeal was denied. June 24, 2025. Thomas woke up at 4:45 a.m. in his death row cell, alone with his thoughts and the knowledge that this would be his last sunrise. He had just one visitor that day, his mother. No spiritual advisor, no final prayers, just silence and the slow passage of time. For his last meal, Thomas made a simple request: a pepperoni pizza, French fries, and a soda. Not elaborate, not symbolic, just comfort food for a man about to die. At 6 p.m., Thomas was led into the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. He wore a plain white shirt and dark pants. From a distance, witnesses noted that he appeared calm, with a healthy color in his skin and no visible signs of fear or distress. When the curtain was raised, Thomas was already scanning the witness room. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, his head turning slightly as he took in the scene. There was no spiritual advisor at his side. He did give a final statement, but it was spoken so quietly that no one in the witness room could hear what he said. With the air conditioning humming and the microphone positioned too far away, only the executioner may have caught his words. It appeared to be a short prayer, but those final words have not been made public. When the lethal drugs began to flow through the IV lines, Thomas's breathing became shorter and more labored. He blinked several times, remained alert for a few moments, then slowly faded away. Within 4 minutes, he appeared unconscious. The usual protocol was followed. A guard leaned in, called his name, and flicked at his eyelid. No response. The signal was given for the second and third doses of the lethal cocktail. At 6:13 p.m., Thomas Lee Gudinas was pronounced dead. He was 51 years old. After more than 30 years, Michelle McGrath finally had justice. Her family could close this painful chapter of their lives, and the citizens of Florida could rest knowing that one of their most dangerous predators would never hurt anyone again. The case of Thomas Lee Gudinas serves as a stark reminder of how quickly a life can spiral out of control, and how a single night of violence can destroy multiple families forever. From a troubled childhood to a brutal crime to 3 decades on death row, his story is one of missed opportunities, failed interventions, and ultimately the consequences of choices that can never be undone. Thomas Lee Gudinas is gone, but the memory of Michelle McGrath lives on. In the end, that's what matters most.